The day is July 15th, 2016. I'm fresh off of work at my local job, a job that I don't really like very much, but it's also my first ever job. I'm in high school, so I'm not supposed to like it. I turn on Netflix, and the first thing that's advertised is a new show called Stranger Things. I've never heard of it, but it seems very 80s small town mystery vibes, and I love those things. So I turn it on, I watch the first episode, then the next one, and then the next one, and I'm thoroughly hooked on the mystery, story, and characters in this show. There's this kid with superpowers and a tattoo of the number 11, some shady government experiments and cover-ups, a monster with the ability to supernaturally kidnap people, weird alternate dimensions, a group of kids riding around town on bikes, a mean old sheriff with a heart of gold uncovering the mystery. This show had everything. For the next couple days, Stranger Things becomes the thing I look forward to the most when I get off of work. I finish the season, hoping that it becomes popular enough for a second season. I tell my friends and family to watch it, and the rest, as they say, is history. I am the reason why Stranger Things became popular. It's strange to think back on this time in my life, a time before Stranger Things was Netflix's flagship show, the show that everybody was foaming at the mouth for more, no matter how long it took between seasons, a show that has become so popular that it's kinda cool to hate on it now. A time before the name 11 was a household name, but that time did exist, and through a mix of a whole lot of different factors, Stranger Things became the show that we know today. Stranger Things as a series kinda baffles me, because in a lot of ways, I still think of this show as the small town mystery that got me through the summer nights working my first job, but I also recognize that the series has undergone so many different changes that my initial love and thoughts of the show are very different to what the show is today. But let's make one thing clear. I do really like this show. Despite some of the missteps and how downright annoying the wait between seasons has become, this is still a great show. There's a reason why it's Netflix's flagship series, and it's gained the popularity it has. But I also think that this show almost got too big for its own good. And that's the premise of this video. I think that if Stranger Things hadn't gained such a massive following, and instead it had its own niche audience that was big enough to sustain a second or third season, Stranger Things could have gone down as one of the greatest series of all time, right up there with Dark, another small-town mystery show that only had 3 seasons and a small cult following, and that show is the greatest show of all time. But Stranger Things still might have that one of the greatest series of all time title by the time the 5th season comes out, barring a total Game of Thrones Season 8 level collapse, but there's a few things as the show got more popular that ultimately ended up hurting the show in the long run. So in this video, I'm going to give all my thoughts on each and every season of Stranger Things in preparation for Season 5. I'm going to go over the highs, the lows of the series, and why I think this series would have worked better if it hadn't gained the popularity it had. So grab your bikes, uncover the mystery at Hawkins' lab, get captured by evil Russians, and fight the Terminator as we journey into the very strange town of Hawkins in Stranger Things. So I don't think I really need to give a recap on this show whatsoever. It's a small-town mystery that spans from the kids to the adults, all working separately until they unite together to finally solve the mystery. It's been told before, it'll be told again, but what separates Stranger Things from others in the genre is its capitalization on 80s nostalgia. People like myself, who were never around for the 80s, have this strange fixation on that time period, the outfits, the technology, the music, the films, so this show really encapsulates all of those things into one story. But this season feels far different from the others. While yes, this show and season are set in the 80s and work in some of those references and tropes from that time period, this is still very largely focused on telling its own story. Everything 80s that we see or hear on screen is just to enhance the story being told. It's not relying on it to tell the story, which deviates greatly as the seasons go on. There's some licensed 80s songs. The soundtrack by Kyle Dixon and Michael Stein sounds very 80s, but other times it doesn't. And some of the songs used in the more dramatic moments in this series aren't even from the 80s at all. But talking about 80s films, this season has tons of references to those movies, whether it be called attention to when they're actually talking about the movies themselves, or if the plot just mirrors a movie from the 80s, it's all here, tropes and everything, but it's also a bit more modernized. There's an advancement of tropes that those other movies didn't get to because they were made in a certain time period, so Stranger Things does its best to play around with certain tropes and tackle different expectations you might have for these characters, which are far and away the best aspect of this entire show. Right from the very beginning, the show hooks you, from its opening scene to its opening episode. In fact, I think Stranger Things has one of the better pilot episodes I've ever seen, and it's really never spoken about in that way, but this is pretty close to as perfect as you could ever want. It makes you want to hit the next episode immediately. It sets up everything perfectly, the boys and their dynamic and personalities all being portrayed through a game of Dungeons & Dragons is very clever. A lot of this feels like genuine banter between the boys. They aren't very popular, but they have a strong bond between them, and that carries on throughout the course of the season. Nancy is the typical teenager sneaking her boyfriend in through the window. Hopper is a drunk who doesn't take his work seriously. Joyce is a single mom doing her best, but is a bit off the rails. And whatever these scientists are doing in this lab is clearly somehow responsible for this monster and Will going missing. It's a lot of show, don't tell, and it works masterfully. And over the course of the season, there's a lot of different things going on, a lot of different plots, side plots, mysteries, characters, but all of this is introduced carefully, and it doesn't overwhelm you with how much stuff this story really contains. And it helps when all of the different points of view are at all times entertaining, telling, and mysterious. With a little hindsight though, the season is funny to look back on. It's crazy that at the time of writing this and uploading this video, the final season isn't even out yet this person is now old enough to be married and have a child. But that's another thing that surprised me about going back to this season, and that's just how good these child actors were. Like I said, a lot of their dynamic feels real and genuine, so that certainly helps these scenes, but even in the more dramatic scenes, these kids nail each and everything that they're asked to do. In the teenage portion of the storyline, Nancy is with the school jock instead of the loner nerdy boy, but eventually warms up to the loner nerdy boy to the point that we root for him over the awful school bully. But this school bully isn't your typical one-dimensional villain that just disappears after the girl gets rid of him like they do in all of those 80s movies. Even by the end of the season, Steve feels like a much different person, and like he was here to be more than just a temporary love interest for Nancy. Steve is a jerk in this season, but he's actually not as bad as I remember. Like, his friends are just over-the-top genuine assholes, but like when Steve rips up Jonathan's photos, he has every right to do that because Jonathan was being really creepy. He's not mean to Barb or anything. He puts a harness on his friends whenever they get too out of line in front of Nancy, and I'm not saying he's a good guy in this season by any means. He's just not as bad as I remember. He's not like irredeemable because I think there was always a plan for him to become someone different. Hopper is your pretty typical big, angry chief of police with a heart of gold type of character, but he also turns into your pretty typical 80s action hero, and these types of people are just incredibly easy to root for because these are the people who usually find answers by any means necessary. But again, he ends up becoming a pretty layered character. He's not just angry for the sake of it. This case becomes very personal to him because he's lost a child before, and he'll do anything to make sure that doesn't happen to another person. But the real draw of the show when it was first premiering was the fact that Winona Ryder was in it. I know it's hard to remember a time before Stranger Things was as huge as it is, but back in 2016, this was more commonly referred to as Winona Ryder's new show, and not Stranger Things. And for good reason, because Joyce Byers is a huge factor in this season and all seasons afterwards. She plays this person who's a little bit off the rails so well, and we know that everybody around thinks that she's crazy, and at first we think maybe she's a little bit crazy too, but she ends up being right about just about everything. And for this season, the groups are largely split into their respective age ranges until they come together at the end. But the real strength of this season and of this show is all of the characters and their dynamics with each other. Mike and Eleven, Nancy and Jonathan, Joyce and Hopper, it's all so great to see these people interact with each other and the other characters in their storylines. And if there's one thing that the Duffer Brothers are really good at writing, it's character dialogue and growing those dynamics, really except for Mike and Nancy, but I'll get to that later. What works so well about this season is that it is a through and through mystery. We don't know what's going on at Hawkins' lab, what happened to Will, what this monster is, and we want to see the answers to all these questions, which also goes along with another big theme of this season, and that's horror. With all of these things being unknown, it leads to a lot of pretty horrific moments. The Demogorgon in the opening scene that has far different powers than we ever see it have again is a big hook into this story, and it's truly very terrifying. When Eleven is first explaining the Upside Down and where Will is and what he's hiding from, so she flips the board upside down, it's a pretty terrifying moment because we have so little context into what she's actually talking about, and again, we want to see more. Will communicating with his mom via the lights and saying he's in danger. Since we as the audience have very little answers to all of this, it leaves it to our imagination to fill in just how much danger he's in and where he is, and that's truly the scariest part of anything in the horror genre, when we just don't know the answers. A huge breakthrough in the mystery comes in episode 4, The Body, where Hopper goes to investigate Joyce's claims about Will's body not being real, and this is an excellent scene and a real turning point in this season because it makes us realize just how powerful these people at Hawkins' lab actually are. It's a standout moment of the season and a standout moment of the series for me. But even throughout this season, there's just a lot of really horrific imagery and more adult themes and content, and this tone doesn't really return to the show until season 4. While seasons 2 and 3 contain some of the horror imagery, it's the tone that I specifically love in this first season. But having a good mystery is only part of it. Another big highlight of the season is how smart it is at connecting the mystery together. Like I said, this is a pretty complex storyline with a lot of different characters and events, all of them having different knowledge of the mystery at any given moment in any given episode. So when Hopper hears that Benny had a young boy in his shop the day that he died, we as an audience know that this is Eleven, but it also leads him to think that it's Will and continue the path down this mystery, and in some way they actually are connected. There's even a moment where Eleven points at a picture of Will, like she knows him or knows what happened to him, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I don't think that she should know about this. There isn't a scene later on in this season, or even the series, that explains this. Was she used to go and look for where Will is before she escaped? I'm gonna assume this just happened off screen, but even if it didn't, this was another scene used to connect everything together, to give both the boys and Eleven the same goal going forward, which was to find Will, even if it seems like most of the other people in town have given up on finding him. Even with all the side plots introduced in this season, a lot of them have a way to connect the story together. When Troy and his mom go to the police station, he mentions a girl with a shaved head that was with Mike and Dustin, which gives Hopper another lead to go off of and even gives a reason for this whole bullying side plot to be here in the first place. And as much as people might not want to hear it, Steve as a character in this season is more of just a glorified side plot, but even he has his moment to shine at the end. Episodes 7 and 8 bring all the different storylines together in a very satisfying manner. Jonathan and Nancy have been working to kill the monster, regardless if Will is dead or not, because they know that this thing definitely took Barb as well. The kids know for a fact that Will is alive because Eleven has told them that and showed them the proof. Hopper eventually comes to realize that Joyce is right about Will and does anything and everything he can to help her find her son. All of these people have different pieces to the mystery, so they come together to share information and move the plot ahead, which allows them to break apart again and actually solve the mystery. While it would be easy for all of the characters to be sidelined in order for Hopper and Joyce to go in and actually find Will, each storyline has its own concrete ending. Nancy and Jonathan try to buy Hopper and Joyce some time by luring the creature in and killing it, Steve even being there to help with this, and while it ultimately doesn't work, it certainly weakens the creature enough for Eleven to actually kill it, and for Hopper and Joyce to find and rescue Will. Everyone has their own ending, and in their own way, they save the day and solve the mystery. One of the things this season, and really this show, does particularly well is making you hit the next episode. Sure, if you're into a show enough, you'll always hit next episode, even if it's 3 a.m. and you have school or work in a few hours, but this season is quite literally designed to make you hit next episode. This is one of the shining examples of all streaming shows and why writing for this format is different from shows on regular cable TV. You know, when you're binging a show and you can tell that it premiered on TV because it would cut to black and then come back and show the previous 5 seconds before continuing on? Well, this show, of course, doesn't have to do that, but each and every episode ends on a cliffhanger that makes you want to watch the next episode. It doesn't have to be much of a cliffhanger, but it keeps you wanting more, keeps you on the edge of your seat, even if what you want is answered in the very beginning of the next episode. The end of episode 3, they apparently find Will's body. The beginning of episode 4, Joyce is adamant that it's not him. The end of episode 5, Nancy is in the Upside Down and is about to be trapped. The beginning of episode 6, she finds her way out. This happens with each and every episode. It's incredibly smart and a bit manipulative writing, but it works, and I do believe this plays at least a small part in what made this season so successful. The season leaves a few things open-ended, like Hopper leaving waffles in the woods and Will's vision of the Upside Down, but they're appropriate cliffhangers, left just in case the show did well enough to warrant a second season, but if it didn't, then the story is all told from beginning to end. There's also this sort of confusing scene between Hopper and these men in a car. He talks about how he made a deal with Brenner, but I don't remember this ever coming back up. I absolutely adore this season of television. I'm always a fan of these small town mysteries, and I think this is one of the more complex versions of those stories that works on every level. Take some personal bias into consideration when I say this, but this is one of my favorite seasons of television of all time. The small town mystery, the horror, the different storylines intersecting and connecting. This season just speaks to me. So I'm going 9.6 out of 10. So with the first season of Stranger Things being a renowned success, production for season 2 began right away, meaning the second season actually came out a little after a year removed from the first season, which is absolutely insane by today's TV standards and insane by Stranger Things standards. But because Stranger Things was this huge success, it meant the second season got a pretty noticeable budget increase, leading to much better visual effects, particularly when it comes to the Upside Down. But with that budget increase came a few cons as well. Either the Duffer Brothers or Netflix themselves thought a big reason why this show was a success was because it was set in the 80s, and that very well may be true, but it certainly wasn't the only reason the show was successful. And this season started a trend with the 80s in this series that I, for one, didn't enjoy. There's an almost constant barrage of licensed music, games, and movies that's overtly reminding you that this is in the 80s, just in case you forgot, I guess. And maybe this is what people liked about the series. It's definitely not the defining feature that I liked about the show, but it seems that's what this season wanted to focus on. Maybe it's because I wasn't alive for the 80s, so outside of some movies, I don't have the same appreciation for all the 80s nostalgia, and I actually cared more for the story and the characters. I don't know, I might be in the minority there. We were left with a few mysteries at the end of the first season. Why is Will still having flashes of the Upside Down, and where is Eleven? We get both of these answers pretty early on, but let's start with 11. 11 is trapped in the Upside Down for all of about 2 minutes and then goes to Mike's heavily guarded house and stands by the window. But no one sees her or can catch her when she runs away. So she's in the woods and finds these waffles in the box that Hopper left for her. But how did he know to leave these waffles at this exact spot? And again, what was the deal that Hopper made with Brenner? These things don't really have concrete answers. Then we have Will. It would make sense that he's having tests run on him by the new people at Hawkins' lab, and that he would in some way still be connected to the Upside Down, so that introduces us to the next big bad of the series, and that's the Mind Flayer. They left all these plot threads in Season 1 so that way they could do a Season 2, but you can tell they hadn't actually really planned out a Season 2. So the real meat of the plot of this season doesn't really start until about halfway through, and the first few episodes are all about resolving those few mysteries and lingering questions from Season 1. But the season does start off on a pretty intriguing note. There's a totally new band of characters, one of them with the power to make people have visions, and this turns out to be number 8. I really liked this opening scene. I thought it was a great way to expand the world and give us some more answers as to why 11 is, well, number 11, and I was excited to see where this would go over the course of the season. Big emphasis on the was excited. And stuff like this is to be expected. This is a sequel, it's even marketed as Stranger Things 2, not Season 2, and all sequels end up going bigger and trying to be better, even if most of the time they miss the mark on the later portion of that statement. The Mind Flayer is a good example of sequels going bigger and better. This thing is equally as terrifying as the Demogorgon. The scene of it rising up in episode 2 is genuinely terrifying, gives a great sense of scale as to how big this thing really is. Things like there being many different Demodogs instead of one Demogorgon is really reminiscent of the difference between Alien and Aliens, not to mention a lot of other references to 80s films. There's a reference to Close Encounters of the Third Kind when Will opens the door, The Exorcist when Will is possessed and his voice changes, and speaking of the Mind Flayer, this thing even looks like a xenomorph. Like I said, this season leaned very heavily on being an 80s TV show, so it was packed head to toe in references, although in this season, some of those references aren't so in your face. If you aren't aware of these other 80s films or tropes, then it's possible you wouldn't get these references. And I think that's fine. Paying homage to these different properties in a very diluted manner was always fine with me. It was that way in the first season too, but again, this changes as the series goes on. A big aspect of this season was, of course, the new characters, but also the new character dynamics. The first 2 episodes are a bit slower of a pace compared to last season, but a lot of this is to build up the characters' chemistry. Like, last season we only got 1 scene of Will and the friends, so we truly didn't get to see a lot of their friendship. This season definitely focuses on that, while also throwing a wrench in the dynamic by adding in Max. The new characters like Max, Billy, and Bob are fine additions, but for this season they really only serve very specific purposes. Billy is now the hotshot bully in school because Steve is a good guy. Max is there for the boys to have a crush on, showing us that they're getting older. Bob is here to show that time has passed, to give Joyce some semblance of happiness in her life, and because this is Sean Astin, the poster child of 80s mystery. Of course, these characters go on to do great things and be strong characters, but in this season, they're kinda just thrown in here to enhance the characters we already know. The unsung hero of this season is Bob, but we'll talk more about him later. The characters and their dynamics are still very strong and prove to be the best part of the season very early on. Characters and their relationships develop, whether that means stronger bonds start to form, like with Joyce and Hopper, or cracks in already formed relationships like Nancy and Steve. There's also new pairings that form throughout the season that are very strong, like Hopper and Eleven, and of course, Dustin and Steve. It's said that a big inspiration for Hopper and Eleven was The Last of Us with Joel and Ellie, and that very much feels like it comes through on screen. Hopper is the reluctant and angry father, Eleven is the sarcastic and rebellious teenager with a very special condition, and both Joel and Hopper have dead daughters named Sarah. Jonathan and Nancy are another duo that have a ton of development. I remember the first time I watched the series and being angry that she was still with Steve by the end of season 1, but that doesn't last very long in this season. And in this season, Jonathan and Nancy are super easy to root for. They're the classic will they, won't they characters, having to get separate beds in the motel and everything. Their journey to Murray's to get his information, but also tell him information, is great for their relationship development and allows us a closer look at Murray, who's just a side character this season, but eventually goes on to be like a main side character because of how great he is in this season. But because these two end up together, it meant that Steve was sidelined for a little bit. It seemed like they didn't really know what to do with Steve this season because they were going to have Jonathan and Nancy be together, so they paired him with Dustin, which quite obviously was a really great choice. This unlikely duo is one of, if not my favorite one in the entire show, and their friendship is my absolute favorite thing to come out of this season. It seems that opinion is shared by a lot of people given how reluctant they are to separate these two from here on out. And speaking of Dustin, he's very clearly the one who has the most to do in the first 4 or 5 episodes, with him getting Dart and keeping it a secret from the rest of the friends for a while. We spend a lot of time solely from his perspective, and we don't really get that much time with the other kids, besides Will, but even then a lot of times it's not solely his point of view. But I think Dustin is the one to get Dart and to very stupidly keep it a secret because he's the character who gets a pass. He's the lovable, funny, innocent, and clueless character, so the audience is more forgiving of his stupid decisions than they would be if this was like Mike doing all of this. It takes a bit of time for the plot to really get set into motion. Part of this is because they have to set up the new characters and plot lines, but part of this is because this show in general is just very slow at setting up new plot lines. Yes, the time it takes can be great because it makes the eventual payoffs for bigger scenes and episodes pack that much more of a punch, but a lot of time it just leaves me wondering when the actual plot is going to move forward. At the end of episode 3, we finally get to see the plot start moving in motion when the Mind Flayer possesses Will because of some advice that Bob gave him. Way to go, Bob. The start of episode 4 is really when things start hitting their stride. There's a lot less in-your-face 80s references and more character drama, and we can really start to see the suspense building. We see Will have a conversation with his mom and really get to see how incredible of an actor Noah Schnapp is. All of the acting in the show is good, even with the kids, but Noah, particularly in this season, is on a completely different level than they are. Will is given a bigger role in this season, and I'm sad to say that this season is his biggest role across all seasons. He plays the difference between Will and the spy incredibly well, and I'm not sure if any of the other kids could have done that. Hopper and Eleven's fight is extremely well acted on both accounts, and really shows us a change in their dynamic that sets the plot further into motion. Hopper also could not have handled this moment worse.
You are like Papa!
Really? I'm like that psychotic son of a bitch?
There's really a dramatic shift between the suspense in the first 3 episodes to episode 4. The editing seems to flow better, the music is less so about reminding you that you're in the 80s and actually telling the story at hand, and the character drama actually seems like drama and it's not just developing characters. Like I said, on one hand, with lots of build-up makes the payoffs better, but I actually felt more engaged with everything happening in episode 4, so I think the first 3 episodes were just a bit too slow getting everything started. Bob gets a great moment to shine, figuring out Will's drawings are actually a map of Hawkins, which leads them to finding and saving Hopper. But things aren't so simple for the lab people because Will is so connected to the Upside Down that if they burn the tunnels, they'll end up killing Will. And this is such a great dilemma for the story to have because they even talk about how it might be worth it for the kid to die in order to put a band-aid over this problem. It leads to a lot of great questions about Will himself, and Mike being the one to figure out that Will is being used as a spy. Episode 6 gives us some of our greatest moments in the entire season. We get the Dustin and Steve interactions, Murray talking, which forces Jonathan and Nancy to finally get together, the gearing up of a big battle, and some great character interactions that develop even our side characters like Max. Tensions build with Steve facing not only Dart, but the twist that there's more Demodogs than they thought. Then we see that Will has given up their position and the men are walking into a trap, and the Demodogs are heading to the lab. Oh man, what a great cliffhanger. I can't wait to see what happens in the next episode. Wait, what is this? This isn't a continuation of last episode. This is an 11-centric episode focused on her meeting the X-Men? I don't care about this. Bring me back to the characters I want to see. 11's story has been so painfully boring this season, and now we have to sit through an entire episode that's basically just a backdoor pilot to a spinoff. There's so much wrong with this episode, it's not even funny. But let's back up a little bit and talk about 11's storyline this season. 11 goes to visit her mother, which in and of itself is an intriguing plotline, but we know ultimately how it ends because Joyce and Hopper already went to go visit her in the first season. That plotline was one of the only issues I had with the first season because it didn't really lead to anything new. It would have been far more impactful for the audience to discover 11's mother's state while we were through the point of view of 11, rather than already knowing what's going to happen. This just adds to 11's plotline being the worst out of all the plotlines this season, because it's just not all that interesting. Sure, it leads to answers about finding more people like her, but that's not exactly a great thing either. Not only is this a weak plotline, but the acting isn't great, the characters aren't interesting, and it couldn't have come at a worse time because they just hooked us with everything happening at Hawkins just to hit pause so that way we can go on a side adventure. To make matters either better or worse, this storyline really doesn't make any sense because it doesn't lead to anything in the future of the show. You can just skip this episode entirely, the only thing you won't know is how 11 got new clothes and a new hairstyle. They set up a really intriguing mystery in the opening scene of the season, but then they don't touch on it again until episode 7, which feels like it's too little too late at that point. I get it, they tried something new and it didn't work, so they didn't elaborate on it in future seasons, which is good rather than them trying to force the idea down our throats, but it makes this entire episode completely worthless and just really cements 11 having the worst storyline this season. On paper, 11 going to meet other people with powers so that way they can help her with hers is a great storyline, but the execution, and I think more importantly, the timing of this plot couldn't have been worse. Literally, if you just skip episode 7, it flows so much better as a season. The different storylines start to converge together, and this is actually a point that allows for greater impact than Season 1, because in Season 1, when the storylines converged, they had to explain about everything going on and how each group knows what they know, but in Season 2, our characters all know each other, they all know what's going on, and this allows for more actions to actually take place. And these last few episodes, nope, not you, feel really impactful and thread the storylines together very well. There's bigger moments, bigger stakes, and even some better writing than there was in the first season. As our characters are meeting and the storylines are finally coming together, it seems that everybody has made it out of Hawkins' lab alive. Until Bob gets attacked by one of the Demodogs. Bob is undoubtedly the unsung hero because he allows for everybody to get out of Hawkins' lab alive, until he meets his, honestly, pretty disturbing end. By far the most disturbing thing we see out of the entirety of Season 2. But this whole sequence in Episode 8 is very tense, engaging, and ultimately heartbreaking. While everybody working together and all the branching storylines coming into one is exactly what they did in the first season, and subsequently what they do in the next season, it really works because of the characters and seeing them all interact with one another. Dustin is trying to explain everything to the group and how they can stop the spy, but Hopper kind of dismisses him because he's just making D&D references. But Dustin continues on. He's like, no, guys, this is serious, until he ultimately realizes the analogy falls apart. It's such a great scene. The Duffer Brothers, like I said, are great character writers, so even when the story suffers a little bit, the characters and their dynamics are great to see. This whole interaction gets even better when the day is saved by 11. While she definitely had the worst storyline this season, she's still 11, and it's a very heartwarming sequence to see her reunite with all the friends, Mike and Joyce, which is much needed after the devastating death of Bob a few minutes earlier. The final episode of the season does two things very well: wrapping up the storylines to a satisfying manner and setting up plotlines for the next season. With season 1, they weren't sure if they were going to get a second season, so all we really got was the one quick glimpse of Will throwing up the slug, which obviously became a central plot of season 2, but the ending of this season showed us things like Billy flirting with Mrs. Wheeler, Billy's backstory with his father, the Mind Flayer watching over Hawkins, and the many other character relationships that would develop in another season. But truthfully, the story is complete. They closed the gate, and Hawkins is back to normal. Sure, the story could continue, but it didn't really need to. At the end of the day, Stranger Things 2 is very much like every other sequel out there. It gets bigger, but not necessarily better. The characters prove to be the strongest aspect of the show, especially with the new interactions like Steve and Dustin, and really just Steve with the rest of the kids. It certainly takes a while for things to get going, and when they get going, they take an abrupt stop so that way we can see what Eleven's up to, and then they get going again. Some of the payoffs in this season are really great, but a lot of the season focuses too much on making sure you know it's set in the 80s than it does telling a story. This isn't a bad season by any means. It's very well acted and written for the most part, and I will always enjoy watching it, but it's nowhere near as strong as the first season. I still love the small-scale mystery elements and kids going on adventures, as crazy or ridiculous the concept might be. It still itches that scratch that I always have for adventure mystery shows. So I'm giving Stranger Things Season 2 a 7.7 out of 10. Alright, time to move on to Season 3. I had only watched this season one time until this recent rewatch of the series, and I remember when I first watched it I thought, yeah, that was pretty good, but not as good as the first two seasons. And I don't know, maybe it's because I remembered really liking Season 4 after this, but Season 3 just absolutely pales in comparison to all the others. And because I've been looking up a lot of stuff about Stranger Things, of course my phone keeps on recommending me Stranger Things pages, and I see nothing but praise when it comes to this season, and I feel like I'm losing my mind, because this, to me, is just so obviously the weakest season, I have no idea how anybody can think otherwise. So if this is your favorite season, please tell me why and how that is in the comments. A big reason why this season fails is because there's no mystery. Everything is shown to us from the opening scene. In the first season, Will gets taken. Where did he go? Who's this girl who escaped from the lab? What's going on in the lab? The second season, what's this new monster? Who's this other person with powers? What's going on with Will? The third season, is there actually something going on with the Russians and the mall? Oh wait, that's not a mystery because it's revealed right away. If the second season had too many 80s references for you, then season 3 might as well just be a straight up spoof of things from the 80s. This season embraced the summer blockbuster trope, and while there's a certain charm to that, it also completely disregarded what Stranger Things was, and what it will be, making this season stick out like a sore thumb. One of the things I really don't like about this plot is how far-fetched it seems. Are Russians really invading Hawkins? That sounds pretty ridiculous, even by Stranger Things standards, and I think if there was a whole conspiracy and the kids were uncovering the mystery, theorizing that there were Russians just to be shot down by Hopper or some other police as a ridiculous idea, and for there to actually be a reveal that, oh no, there are Russians here, that might have been cool. But it's also kind of a double-edged sword, because if that was the way things happened, it might have just seemed even more laughably silly. The other plot going on in this season revolves around the rats, and everything happening with Billy, and this is certainly the more interesting storyline. But again, it kinda seems obvious what's going on here, so the mystery is just presented to us automatically. We see what happened with Billy, and we're just waiting for the characters to piece it together. which is a far cry from what happened in the last 2 seasons. And I think part of the heart of Stranger Things as a story is all the mystery. So when you take that out of the story, it feels like there's something missing. But in this season, there's a big emphasis on everyone growing up. The first scene we see with Elle and Mike is them making out. They're going on dates to the movies, Dustin has a girlfriend now, and even the older teens are now getting jobs and aren't at school anymore. Hopper's going to Joyce for parenting advice. It just seems like everybody has entered a new phase of life. And then on the flip side, there's Mrs. Wheeler trying to get younger. There's not a whole ton of new characters this time around. The 2 biggest ones are Alexi, who I'll talk about later, but certainly the biggest one is Robin, Steve's new co-worker at his Scoops Ahoy job who tells him how bad he is at getting girls. I'm sure this isn't gonna be his new super obvious love interest. Seriously, this show is getting so predictable. Anyways, I actually really like Robin, more than a lot of the new characters that get introduced in subsequent and past seasons. She's a no-nonsense, sarcastic girl who embraces the mystery, so whenever she's on screen, it's mostly to further the actual plot. I hope they don't change her entire personality in subsequent seasons. Anyways, this whole theme of growing up is really emphasized by Will's character. This whole season, he's clinging onto the past and wants things to go back to how they were, because for the past 2 years, he was robbed of a lot of those moments between him and his friends. They all grew up and left him in the past, and it's honestly very heartbreaking because this kid was robbed of his childhood. But also, after the first few episodes, they kinda just stop addressing this. All of the characters this season seem a bit like caricatures of who they were in previous seasons. Hopper is supremely over the top on every occasion. Steve seems to be even more of an idiot now. It just kind of seems like each person's main trait was just dialed up to 11 in a bit of a goofy way. And in doing so, it really messed with the tone of the season. We're seeing a drunk Hopper blow a raspberry in somebody's face, and then the next scene, we watch as Billy strangles and kidnaps a girl. It just feels a little all over the place. Hopper in particular is just absolutely insufferable across the first 3 episodes. Joyce stands him up, and if this is how he acted, then I would stand him up too. This is like Robot Chicken Hopper edition. I don't know what they were thinking or what David Harbour was thinking, but he's terrible in this season. I think maybe he thought the louder he could be, the better performance it was, because it certainly seems that way. Of course, a really great pairing this season is Steve and Robin, and over the course of the season, we think that this girl was clearly introduced to become his new love interest. He slowly starts falling for her, there's jokes that Dustin makes about Steve getting to spend more time with her. They have great chemistry and character building moments, like Steve admitting that popularity isn't the greatest thing in the world. And then comes the moment where they finally admit their feelings for each other, and Steve does, but Robin doesn't, because she doesn't like Steve, or any other guys for that matter. I think this is a brilliant piece of misdirection and writing. I think it's a very clever way to have representation in a story because of how everything was framed from the very beginning. I certainly didn't see it coming, and to see Steve just kind of accept this and move on gives them another notch in their relationship and dynamic. It does kinda spell another doom for Steve later on, but I'll get to that later. Just like last season, it takes a little while for things to get going, but with this season, it seems a little more dramatic. The mystery being told with the rats and the Russians and what's going on with Billy is very shallow and doesn't seem to be very important. What is important is the character dynamics and building that up. Now, with this being the 3rd season, I think this slow start is more to do with world building and focusing on the characters that we know and love. There's new friendships like Eleven and Max, a romance brewing between Hopper and Joyce, even though she's going through a rough time with Bob's death, and each and everything to do with the new Starcourt Mall, which they clearly spent a ton of money on, so they were going to get their money's worth for that set. Some people probably really like these small character building moments, and I do too. Sometimes it is nice to see characters that we love go through good times. But I think with this season in particular, the pacing really suffers from it. But just like with everything in this video and every video I've ever made, that's just my opinion. I'm sure plenty of other people who enjoy seeing these moments more than the mystery and how it unravels. In the first season, a lot of the high school and teen drama was balanced very well with the world building and the mystery, but in this season, it felt like for every one scene that was spent on building the mystery, there were 7 scenes on funny world building or character moments. The third episode does end up ramping things up a bit quicker. When it's rainy out, we see a bit more of Billy's plan unfolding and figure out how there is clearly something going on with the Russians, unless all malls in the 80s had armed security guards speaking Russian, protecting new shipments of clothes. I don't know, I wasn't there. And speaking of the Russians at the mall, this comes along with a bit of silliness. So let's talk about this guy who is essentially the Terminator. I take huge issue with this whole aspect of the season because I am a Terminator fan. I assume the Duffer Brothers are too, and that's why they added this in here, but they got what works about the Terminator completely wrong. What worked about the Terminator was that it was an unstoppable killing machine. No matter what they did, they just could not kill it until a very last-ditch effort. The scariness of the Terminator isn't just getting a Wish.com version of Arnold, putting him in a leather jacket and riding a motorcycle. This whole aspect is by far the most in-your-face reference to a movie from the 80s, and just the mere presence of this character takes me out of the story entirely. Not to mention how this guy is literally just doing an Arnold impression when he talks. It's the silliest thing this show has ever done, and that's saying quite a bit. And it's not like a storyline like this couldn't work if it was just disguised a little bit better. Imagine we have this massive Russian guard who's intimidating in his own right, and then he gets caught by Billy or the Mind Flayer, but the Mind Flayer realizes, wow, holy crap, this guy is a tank, and with his new zombie-like abilities, he'll be even more unstoppable. You know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna send him out on a quest for revenge against Hopper because he's the one who was helping Elle, or something like that, and if Hopper's dead, then my quest to get 11 will be far easier. And then everywhere Hopper and Joyce go, this dude follows and tries to kill them, but no matter what Hopper does, he can't seem to kill this guy because he's one of the Mind Flayer's puppets. That would mirror the plot of the first Terminator movie and mimic that same horror, but it wouldn't have to be a super in-your-face reference that doesn't even make all that much sense. The stakes this season are just far bigger than seasons past. I get that the threat of Russians was a very big thing in the 80s, but when there's a group of teenagers just sneaking around a very vibrant underground Russian base and no one is noticing them even though they're in plain sight, it gets ridiculous.
It's just like ridiculous, the stuff that we're doing, like a Russian mall base.
Steve is getting beat up and is in a life or death situation, but he's making a lot of jokes about it. The tone just seems all over the place, and it makes the stakes seem like a joke. I'm pretty sure Dustin straight up kills a dude and the scene is played for laughs. I'm not sure what this weapon is, but we never see this doctor again, so I'm assuming this electrical shock just stopped his heart. Now, I'm not saying that I hated this season. In fact, I think it gets a lot of things right. The budget once again increased, leading to better CGI for this goopy monster.
It's the appetizer!
But this also led to an increase in the cinematography. It feels like each and every shot that they wanted to do this season, everything that they planned out, everything that they storyboarded, they were able to achieve with this budget. So some of the bigger action sequences are really great. Even just a lot of the lighting in the CGI heavy sequences look better than it did in seasons past. And I truly think this is the reason for the big time difference it took between seasons, because with this higher budget meant they could do some more creative things horrifically. One of the things I really like about the season is how it has a higher emphasis on horror than the second season had. Everything about this real version of the Mind Flayer in this season is focused on body horror, with the rats turning into goops and eventually people turning into goops and combining together. It brings back that horror feeling and adds a new one that hasn't been in the show at all. Everything about Billy transforming seems right out of a vampire or werewolf movie with a full moon included in everything. The way the faces of these people look and how zombified they get is particularly terrifying and very reminiscent of older zombie films. The Jonathan and Nancy hospital scene particularly stands out to me and feels like a sequence right out of Resident Evil. In fact, a lot of this season reminds me of Resident Evil, and I think that Natalia Dyer should absolutely be in Zach Cregger's Resident Evil film, but that's a whole other discussion. There's a missed opportunity because Jonathan is about to be killed, then is saved by Nancy, and then he delivers the final blow, but so does Nancy at the same time. It would have been cool for this to be traded off. Nancy saves Jonathan because she hurts the creature, and then she could have been disarmed, and then Jonathan delivers the final blow to save her. And I know this sounds small, but there's a lot of little decisions like this that just kind of feel like this draft of the script wasn't that polished. And this continues to happen throughout the rest of the season. Jonathan tries his hardest, gets his ass kicked, Nancy tries to save him and makes some headway, but she can't do it, and then Eleven comes in and actually saves the day by holding out her hand as hard as she can. This exact same thing happens 3 times in this season. Jonathan is absolutely useless. As soon as Lucas picks up the axe, he actually helps. And this is kind of the same thing throughout the series. Jonathan is just not great in any of these combat situations. All the people who have been infected get killed and morphed into the Mind Flayer, which is a very horrific scene, especially when you see the people beforehand and there's this kid. I feel like this would have been a good opportunity to include Mrs. Wheeler and raise the stakes, and I ultimately think that was probably part of the first draft of this script, but they couldn't find a way to have this great giant battle against the Mind Flayer at the mall without killing Mrs. Wheeler, so that's why they didn't do it. With the amount of stuff that goes on in this town, and when it's the same group of people involved, you'd think by this point they'd have like a weekly meeting just to discuss the strange happenings, try and get to the bottom of stuff before it's too late. Why aren't Steve and Dustin going to Hopper and just flat out showing him the armed guards and all the information that they have about the Russians? Why do all the kids meet to talk about the Mind Flayer and immediately think it's about Billy? Now I get it. Part of why the pacing of the show in seasons past worked was all about how the groups were split up, and when they get together, it brings all aspects of the story together. And that really worked in the first season when these characters didn't know each other. It worked in the second season when everybody had different secrets to keep, whether that was Hopper keeping 11 or Dustin keeping Dart, but this season doesn't have any of that. Even when the kids are all at odds with each other, they unite when things get serious, but they don't ask for help or tell anyone anything else that could be important. This really makes the least amount of sense when it comes to the Starcourt Mall plotline. It never occurs to Dustin or Steve to go and get Hopper or any other higher authority. Now, I get it, they're mostly comedic relief, but Robin is actually really smart. So why wouldn't she suggest they go and find somebody to tell this to? She's like a Cold War code breaker with how smart she is, yet apparently she just wants all this credit to herself, I guess? The formula for Stranger Things had been shown twice over now, and with this season, it was just very apparent that everyone was going to be split up regardless of if they could help each other much earlier on, and they'd all come together, figure out the mystery, and save the day at the end. And with this season taking over 2 years to come out, it just seems like the storyline should have been more polished. What if everybody came together at the start of the season and then splits up for half the season into certain groups, then those groups all come back together, and then at the mid-season point they switch over once again? This worked wonders in season 2 when they paired Steve and Dustin together. What if the same thing was true with Hopper and Steve, or Jonathan and Lucas, or really any other combination other than the ones that we've already seen? In the 5th episode, there is some semblance of this, with Jonathan and Nancy coming to share their information with the kids, and vice versa, and I really liked that aspect. But I also think they only did that because Jonathan and Nancy's whole plotline was done, so they just combined it with the others. But I guess there was a tried and true method, so they just stuck with it. But this season didn't deliver the same results as the other 2 seasons did. I think part of why this season feels so disjointed to me is because the 2 major storylines going on, everything at the mall with the Russians and then everything happening with Billy and the Mind Flayer, are so disconnected from each other. 6 episodes into the season, and it's like there's 2 separate seasons of storylines just combined into one. The Russians are trying so hard to open the gate to the other side, and they don't even realize that there's something from the other side already among them. And it really takes until the last episodes of the season for everything to come together. And even then, it's only because Eleven and everybody goes to Starcourt Mall to find Dustin, having no inclination about anything going on with the Russians. There isn't some clever way that both storylines connect, it's just that they all at the last minute decide to meet up and all hell breaks loose. In the other seasons, there was always something that brought everybody together, whether that be prior knowledge of where people were, or because they already knew where people were and they hear a noise that leads them in that direction. This season just doesn't really have that because there's no connection between the 2 storylines. Alexei is the latest character that the writers introduced to be extremely likable, just so that way they could kill him off in a heart-wrenching way. The first season had Benny, and to an extent Barb, the second season had Bob, and the third season had Alexei, and they didn't even really try to hide what they were doing. Alexei always had the cute and funny moments, had him form a relationship with Murray, and yeah, his death is sad, it hurts their own objective, but I knew this was coming the minute he was sipping on that slushie in the car. Everything and everyone, however disjointed it may be, all ultimately end up at the mall trying to explain what the other people have been going through, and nobody really understands what the others mean because it doesn't make sense. There's 2 separate scenes of everybody explaining what they've seen and what they've been doing and catching everybody up, and there were scenes like this in the previous seasons, but it was more so just sharing different aspects of the same story and information. This is just a cluster of different worlds clashing. But even after they all come together, they just separate back into the same groups they all came in beforehand. And I take issue with this because so much of what works in this show is the characters and their dynamics with different characters. So why not switch them up in a way that makes sense? Why is Erica staying with the group she was with and not going home with her brother? I know they ultimately don't end up going home, but that feels like what a 10-year-old should be doing. But sibling dynamics in this show are certainly not a strong suit of the writing, which feels weird from a show written by the Duffer brothers. Now, a lot of this was probably due to the scheduling of the actors. Since they were already paired together, they could just film the stuff that they needed to from the final episode too, and just keep the groups the same. But it just annoys me. The final fights going on are all really climactic and theatrical and enjoyable to watch, but it does feel a little strange to me that Eleven is the one having this emotional breakthrough with Billy. Billy and Eleven don't even actually know each other. They've never met, and for them to be bonding over Billy's memories instead of, let's say, his actual sister, feels so strange to me. If this was Max on the ground pleading with Billy about standing up for what's right and helping her and her friends, thus bringing him back, that would make so much more sense and would feel much more emotional than Eleven being the one doing this, because she has no connection with Billy. Max could be talking about their relationship and their dynamic, and all these flashbacks could still happen to make him change his mind, but it's not what happens. It's like all the lines are present, but they just don't really connect them in the right ways. There is this attempt to give Billy a redemption arc. Elle sees his whole backstory, and it's just an extension of what we saw him going through with his dad in season 2, and then how his actual mother abandoned him, which explains to a certain extent how and why he is the way he is with women, but I truthfully don't really buy this as a redemption. He does one good act in his final moments, and suddenly from here on out, all is just forgiven. Billy was not a good person. He wasn't from the moment he showed up in season 2. He wasn't until his last scene in season 3. I see a ton of people talking about his redemption online, but I don't see it that way whatsoever. And the big grand death of the season is, of course, Hopper. He sacrifices himself so that way the gate can be closed. Again, there's this great giant emotional sequence at the end with Eleven reading a letter from Hopper. It's very sad, and even though Hopper was kind of annoying this season, it's gonna be tough to go on without him. Kind of weird though, there was this like giant cut to black right before he died, and he wasn't in the wide shot when the device was exploding. There's a post-credit scene talking about an American. I wonder if this is all going to be some big conspiracy for theorists online to debate and that he'll actually be alive. No, that would be so stupid. Right? The Byers are finally moving away. I feel like they should have moved away like after season 1, realistically, and it's a pretty sad overall ending. Jonathan and Nancy are gonna have to do long distance, Elle is moving away with the Byers and she's lost her powers, and once again, there's nowhere for the story to really go from here. The gate is closed. Again, the Mind Flayer is now dead, so what's above that? Are they gonna do something like reveal there's secretly been this grand villain pulling the strings from behind the scenes from the very beginning, even though there was no setup of that whatsoever? No, of course not. That would be stupid. Right? There is certainly a charm to this season and its campiness, and I'm sure, well, actually I know there's a great amount of people who really like that, wish that there was probably another season like this that copied a ton of things from the 80s movies, but this season just didn't do it for me. Because it really does feel like it's just a copy of popular 80s films. It doesn't feel like it's taking inspiration from them or nods to them in clever ways. It just feels like a cheaper imitation. And that's just not what Stranger Things is to me. That's not the Stranger Things that I enjoy. So for that reason, I didn't particularly like this season at all. With that being said, this is still probably an above average season of television. So I'm gonna give season 3 of Stranger Things a 6.2 out of 10. So in order to talk about season 4, and really season 5 as well, we have to talk about how long the wait between seasons was and just how hyped up these seasons are. By season 4, Stranger Things was far and away Netflix's most popular series, allowing them to raise prices whenever the next season was around the corner, but it took almost 4 years for season 4 to release. Now, there were some external factors for this, but it just allowed Netflix to continue teasing the audience with trailers and interviews about how big this season was, and to their credit, they were exactly right. There are multiple different storylines this season with multiple different things going on across the entire world. Everything in this season is, at the same time, much grander in scale, while also bringing the show back to its smaller scale roots. And that's a very tough thing to balance, but I actually think this season does it well. The Duffer Brothers compared this season to an early season of Game of Thrones, and that's quite the statement to make, to compare your season to some of the greatest seasons of television ever made, but honestly, I do see the comparison, and I do see the intent to try and make this like a season of Game of Thrones. The first trailer for this season showed us all that Hopper was in fact alive. I think the internet just guessed it and everybody knew it, so they're like, yeah, whatever, let's just come right out and say it. Yeah, he is alive. But it also retroactively makes it really weird to have such an emotional moment for his sacrifice if they were just gonna reveal he was alive in the first trailer. Yes, they also did this in the trailer for season 2 when they showed us that Eleven was alive, but there was proper setup that she was gonna return, and let's face it, everybody knew that she would be back. Hopper, on the other hand, would have been a really great reveal when we were actually watching season 4 to find out he was alive. But I feel like this has more to do with Netflix and the executives rather than the Duffer Brothers themselves. They wanted David Harbour on the press tour, they wanted to make sure the dads would still watch just in case they were going to stop because of Hopper's death, but it makes that entire emotional send-off in season 3 feel very diluted. But I guess it was always going to feel diluted whether they revealed it in the trailer or not. But after this first teaser trailer, it wasn't until over 2 years later that the season would actually be on Netflix. This was also the first season to split up the episodes, the first 7 premiering in May before the final 2 episodes came out in July, allowing everybody to get caught up and talk about the reveals from episode 7 before continuing onward, building the hype online so that way more people would watch it. Which makes episode 7 feel kind of like a finale itself. In fact, it is a bit strange that they cut up the episodes this way, only leaving 2 episodes afterwards, but episode 7 is the big one of the season, even compared to the 2 that come after that. It's the highest rated episode of the entire series, it's got the big climactic reveals that connect the entire series together, and I do actually think this is among the best episodes of the series. But like I said, the storylines in this season feel like they try to connect everything to the past, which is a noble effort, and I think a great majority of it works. But there's also times it's painfully obvious that this story and everything with Vecna was not what was originally intended for this story. There's a lot of additions to the story that retroactively make other things in the past make more sense, like how Eleven actually escaped the Hawkins facility and a more concrete explanation for how the lights work in the Upside Down, answering how Will was able to communicate with Joyce back in Season 1. With this also comes a fair bit of retconning, like how Eleven's powers actually came from One, and experiments trying to replicate his powers, not from the experiments on her mother, meaning that Eight's powers in Season 2 feel like even more of a wild card now. There's an immediate change in tone from the last season right from the very first scene. Everything is far more grounded and seemingly smaller scale, just like Seasons 1 and 2. We're not starting with a Russian Transformers CGI device. Nope, everything is much more grounded, and I could not welcome this change more. The characters are all much more grown up, both visually and maturity-wise, and while all of the kids are now just freshmen in high school, they do kind of act the same way that Nancy, Steve, and Jonathan did back in the first season. And with all the trauma that they've been through, it does make sense that it would age them up quite a bit. But mainly, what I love about this season is how much it feels like a continuation of Season 1. This season fully embraces the mystery and the horror that made the first season so great. There's no more 80s references just for the sake of it. This is just focused on telling a story that has a backdrop of being set in the 80s, just like the first season. Vecna, particularly in the beginning, is such a terrifying villain. What he can do to people is horrific, and with how mysterious this villain is, it really makes me want to hit next episode because of the mystery, not just to see the characters continue onwards until the mystery presents itself to them. This season, across the many different storylines, has one consistent tone. It's darker and more dramatic, and of course, there's moments of levity, but not at the compromise of the tone like Season 3 had. The moments of levity have the right pacing, and the scenes don't feel jarring when there is a more lighthearted scene. The characters are much more toned down, they don't feel like caricatures like they did in the last season, at least most of them don't, and this season actually feels like prestige TV once again. The writing is better, the characters and their dynamics are better, the pacing is better, and I'm not saying that this season is perfect, in fact, far from it, but it's a major return to form from Seasons 3 and even Season 2. But because this season is split up into different storylines, figured I'll take it one by one, starting with the best storyline in the season, and that's, of course, California. No, I'm kidding. Of course, it's everything happening in Hawkins. Just like all seasons, a lot of the mystery happens right in Hawkins. And the mystery presented in this season is all about Vecna. Very early on, we see that this new character, Chrissy, has strange visions and hears this clock chiming until she ultimately meets her end by seeing Vecna. All of the major players in Hawkins this season are mostly a mix-up of different dynamics and characters that we've seen from the past, but what makes this mystery so enticing is how different it seems from all the mysteries of the past. At first, it doesn't seem to be related to anything weird from Hawkins' lab or the Upside Down, and for a while when I first watched this season, I was fully on board with that. I didn't really know how that would be or how that could be, and it's ultimately not. But the storyline takes our characters on so many different courses, on the trail of this murderer Victor Creel, which is the most serial killer name of all time, to the Creel house to try and figure out who Vecna actually is and how he's killing and choosing his victims. It's all incredibly exciting and more of the typical Season 1 Stranger Things stuff. I found myself incredibly excited to watch whatever scenes were going on in Hawkins than a lot of the other storylines. And just like all seasons, a lot of the new characters come from Hawkins, so let's talk about Chrissy and Eddie, everybody's favorite fan fiction couple. It felt very obvious very early on that this would be the new character that everybody would grow to care for, just to die at the end of the season. And that's exactly what happens. What I didn't expect, though, was for Joseph Quinn to go on and become this mega star who I don't think has slept since he was cast in Stranger Things. At least that's what it seems like whenever I see him in interviews. I think he's already the biggest star out of all the teenage Stranger Things cast, and I think he's already got a brighter career right now than any of the others will probably ever have. And I really didn't think too much of it when I first watched this season, but Joseph Quinn is actually really great in this role. He adds a whole different dynamic and dimension than the rest of the cast. He's really funny with his physical humor, he's great at the more dramatic scenes, and I can definitely see why he's got a lot of roles. But other than these two, one of which isn't in more than a single episode, all of the other new characters introduced are pretty terrible, particularly Jason. I'm not sure what it is about the Duffer Brothers and their love for a bully character, but Jason fills that role this season. They even have other bullies for 11 over in California, and also 11 in the flashbacks. Seriously, if there's a bully character in Season 5, I am done watching this show. Alright, yeah, I will, but I really don't get the obsession over having a bully in every single storyline. But Jason and his group of jocks don't develop even remotely over the course of this season like Steve or even Billy did, and he also just dies at the end. I'm sure this character will either only get a passing mention in Season 5, or just not at all, and most people will probably not remember who he is. This season takes us back to some good old high school drama. Lucas is becoming more popular, he's on the basketball team and makes the game-winning shot, and apparently Mike and Dustin want to play Dungeons & Dragons again, so they join the Hellfire Club. Too bad for Will now that he's moved away. Erica makes the game-winning shot in D&D, Nancy works as the editor of the paper, Steve is still friends with Robin, so he's one of the jocks who goes back to his high school games, and Max is still grieving her dear great brother Billy. And because this is the main group in Hawkins, they're all directly responsible for uncovering the mystery in different ways. In fact, this storyline kind of seems like it's a spin-off or just like another season without some of the main characters after they left the show thinking they could find better jobs. But unlike those cases, this actually works. Lucas is working with the popular kids who eventually start looking for Dustin. That gives him a huge conflict, and we think maybe he's in with these popular kids searching for Eddie, but if you can see it, there's some visual clues that show us this isn't true. You see how Lucas isn't wearing the Letterman jacket while the others are? That's the visual clue. The group's even split up, like I complained about how they didn't do enough in Season 3, seeing Robin and Nancy together, and this is a great pairing, even if this version of Robin seems like a completely different character than last season. She doesn't seem confident or smart, she seems a little ditzy and absent-minded. I don't know, maybe she's spent too much time with Steve and adopted his traits. The older teens band together, and then the younger teens band together, seeing Eddie interact with the other older teenagers who are his age but not in high school. I love seeing these different pairings. It brings a lot of great moments and dialogue. Max, being a target of Vecna's, raises the stakes a great amount and makes sense for the story. It definitely feels like the Duffer Brothers wrote Vecna's victims to be people with trauma so that it would give Max a greater role, and so they could write the episode Dear Billy. And her whole sequence at the graveyard and getting away from Vecna is one of the highlights of the season because it also feels like there's actual stakes to this scene. I didn't know if Max was gonna die here or not. They felt real because the tone of the show made it feel that way. It's one of the scenes that makes this season feel far more adult than the previous two seasons. It's a phenomenal scene and the tone is never changed or played for laughs. It's just all around really powerful storytelling. This episode also gives us insight into Victor Creel and his whole backstory, which is maybe the darkest sequence in all of Stranger Things. One of the things I did find incredibly strange about this storyline is the budding re-romance of Steve and Nancy. It reminds me of something like The Vampire Diaries, or really any other love triangle story. Two characters get together, but then the sexual tension is gone between them, so they need that person to want the other person again, and then they just keep switching between the two. So to retread this whole storyline once again feels odd to me, and it feels like they just didn't really know what to do with Steve, since he didn't have a love interest anymore because everything built up between him and Robin last season was all just misdirection. But at the same time, I can't even hate on this too much because Steve is great in this season, and Jonathan is not. But I'll get there. Part of the reason the stakes feel so high in the storyline is because 11 isn't here. There isn't the usual coming together at the end and everybody working together to solve the mystery and save the day. This group is pretty sparse, so it makes everybody contribute in different ways, especially towards the end of the season. But I'm going to talk about the other storylines first before talking about those final 2 episodes. So let's talk about California. As excited as I was to see a scene in Hawkins, I was equally as disappointed to see a scene in California. California has to be my least favorite storyline across all seasons of Stranger Things, namely for the complete and total character assassination of Jonathan Byers. Jonathan is sidelined in the worst possible fashion and demoted to your stereotypical stoner. He offers nothing of help to anybody other than the fact that he's able to drive a car. All of his motivations and aspirations from the previous seasons are completely absent here. He just didn't want to go and visit Nancy so that way there could be some strife between them, opening the door for Steve once again. And as somebody who used to really like and root for Jonathan in the early seasons, this just feels like a completely different person. There's even the other guy, who's an extra in all stoner films, and this is another pretty terrible side character. I never found any of his jokes or quips to be very funny. I'm honestly pretty glad that Argyle will not be in Season 5. 11, of course, starts her journey here before getting arrested and intercepted by Sam, and then Mike comes to join the sideline with Jonathan and Will. Same with Joyce and Murray. They both start their journey here, but after receiving a note that Hopper's alive, they eventually leave to go and be part of a more relevant storyline instead. This season does share the same issues that Season 2 and 3 had with slow beginnings, but that is solely due to this plotline. We see very intense things happening in both Hawkins and Russia, but this plotline has some friendship and bullying issues with one of the world's most powerful people. So this whole plotline just brings the pacing down, but for the first time, it's not just the first couple episodes, it's the entire season. In episode 4, there's this tracking shot in the house with the one agent who goes John Wick on everybody, and this is great. This is exciting, the cinematography is incredible, it's entirely unexpected. Does it make up for the rest of the lackluster story? No, it doesn't, but this is still really cool. Will's whole personality and storyline this season is boiled down to a message. The very same message that the show has covered already and in a much better manner with Robin in Season 3. Now, if the writers want to make Will gay, that's fine. There has actually been quite a bit of setup for this from the very beginning, an aspect that I didn't actually pick up on my first watch of this series. Call my gaydar bad all you want, but that's whatever. Like I said, this is just a retread of a storyline this series has already done before. And done well, I might add. So for Will's only thing to do across this whole season is to be sad about Mike instead of having that be his internal conflict and giving him another external conflict, it feels extremely on the nose and honestly a little bit unwarranted. When we finally get the big emotional payoff scenes when he talks to Mike and Jonathan, it's like, wait a minute, that's it? That's what this entire storyline has been leading to? They did the same thing with Robin, but I think it was more emotional, and she had a much more solid character and storyline in the process. Will's whole character is about being connected to the Upside Down in some way, so why on earth would they remove this character from that plotline? It gives him nothing to do. There's some more funny moments with them going to Susie's house and that whole sequence. Really, that's the only thing that Mike adds to this story, but it doesn't really pick up until they finally reunite with 11 in the 8th episode. And by then, this whole storyline is basically a wash. It's far and away the most boring, the most poorly written, and just ultimately feels like everybody is here because they didn't have anything to do in the actual proper storylines. I just really think everybody here should have gone back to Hawkins after like the second or third episode. Alright, so now let's go over everything in Russia, which, like I said earlier, is a pretty good storyline. I do feel like the only reason why the storyline even remotely works is because of the introductions of the Russians last season and how much better everything is handled here. Hopper is going through hell. He was captured and apparently transported to Russia for interrogation, which does seem a bit strange, but you can really feel the stakes of this entire storyline and just how harsh everything is. This feels far more realistic and darker in tone than last season, but if the whole Russian mall thing didn't happen last season, then this storyline would be straight up silly even with its darker tone. But this is all around an improvement over last season, so I don't have too much to complain about. Hopper escaping and going through with his whole plan feels so tense and like it could actually go wrong. It doesn't feel like, since he's a good guy, he's just gonna get away. His whole fight with the Russian feels like there's actual stakes to it, and that's more than I can say out of the entirety of Season 3. With this whole Russia plotline, the differences between Seasons 3 and 4 are night and day. It feels like two completely different shows. And it's entirely unexpected when he does escape, but is then brought back, and everybody involved in this story is betrayed. It's so heartbreaking to see, especially with how happy Hopper was a second ago, eating a jar of peanut butter. This might be an out-of-pocket comparison to some of you, but for those who have watched my channel for a while, this entire sequence is really what I wanted to see out of The Ones Who Live, and Rick Grimes trying to escape from the CRM. This is just a masterful sequence in pacing, tension, and heartbreak, and that's what I wanted to see out of that show. David Harbour's performance is also particularly great. How he went from this cartoonish caricature in Season 3 to delivering what I think is his greatest performance ever is a testament to how different the tone and the writing in this season actually is. Everything with Joyce, Murray, and Urey is more so to bring a bit of levity to this very dark and depressing storyline, and I think it's done appropriately. Murray has always been the comic relief character, so it doesn't feel too out of left field. When they finally do see Hopper, it feels very Game of Thrones to me. Characters reuniting under bad circumstances across the world from where they once were. Them having to watch as a Demogorgon potentially kills Hopper is another very tense sequence, and this Demogorgon is absolutely insane. I'm going to choose to believe that this is a fully grown Demogorgon and not the same sized one from Season 1, because in no way, shape, or form is Steve Harrington defeating this thing with a baseball bat. Joyce and Hopper's reunion is so heartwarming, and it's of course at the end of episode 7, so we had to wait to see it resolve until months later, which means I'm going to wait to talk about it later too. So let's move on to 11's storyline. When 11 decides to leave and get her superhero powers back, she runs into Papa, who's actually alive somehow, and then he gets her to relive her memories of her time at Hawkins' lab. Now, this whole storyline intrigues me because I really don't think this was the plan to explain all the other numbers and the experiments for the kids. I think the original plan was for the Lost Sister to spawn some sort of spin-off, and all of the other kids and other numbers would get explained in that show. The Duffer Brothers are very clearly huge X-Men fans with the amount of references this show makes to it, and I think that spin-off show would have had a lot of other kids in it with other unique powers. In this season, there really aren't any unique powers, it's just all kids with telekinesis and mind reading. But with Season 4, knowing that they failed showing another number in Season 2, they still needed to address the other kids and other experiments, so they do their best with that here. The whole suppressed memories aspect feels a little bit forced and like it's the easiest way they could explain what happened to the other kids without having to go back and incorporate number 8 back into the story. As for number 8 in this season, they don't even really mention her whatsoever other than a throwaway line from Henry about how she's not here anymore. Did they get rid of her because she had a different power than the rest? Does that mean there's other superpowers in this world? I don't know, and I don't think we'll ever find out. I do think it's clever how they use adult 11 in the memories since she's learning them for the first time, but when they do really need to emphasize how small and young she was, then they use this CGI version. And it doesn't look amazing, but since it's used sparingly, it's fine. Everything about the episode 7 reveal is great. I did find it a bit strange that Nancy was the one on the opposite side of everything with the reveal, but I also don't really know who else would have been a better candidate to learn all this. She was the one putting together the mystery with Victor Creel, so it makes sense. But the back and forth reveals of the Creel backstory and number 1 being Vecna brings the mystery and the story full circle in a better way than any of the seasons have done before this. Like I said earlier, it feels painfully obvious that this wasn't the clear plan from the beginning, but what they came up with here is so great that I kind of give it a pass that there's no foreshadowing to it.
No!
Yes.
No!
In episode 8, when Eleven's choosing to leave the facility, even though Brenner wants her to stay because she isn't ready to face Vecna yet, is this sort of twisted version of Luke leaving Yoda, and I think this is a very smart homage to that movie. If this was season 3, Brenner would have started talking like Yoda and turned green to really hammer that reference home. And this whole storyline for 11 kinda does exactly what the Lost Sister episode did for her, learn more about her backstory and greatly enhance her powers, but the way it's done in this season, with proper time and build-up, is much better than how they did it in a single episode back in season 2. In the final episode, Joyce and Hopper finally kiss now that Hopper's gotten rid of his dad bod and slimmed down, and they ultimately end up deciding to stay in Russia because they need to make sure this lab and this Demogorgon is destroyed. With all the troubles of travel in this season, it's actually cool to see that not everybody comes together in the final act to save the day, but they all help from their own respective storylines. It's a break of the usual mold that this show has done in the past, and I really like that, because if the final episode, everybody somehow managed to make their way back to Hawkins in time for the final battle, it would probably come across a little bit cheesy. Eddie's sacrifice is entirely expected, but it's also very sad, frustrating, and heroic all at the same time. Sure, he could have gone up and saved himself, but he also ends up saving everyone by buying them a bit more time. Everyone gets their own very cinematic time to shine. There's Eddie versus the Bats, Lucas fighting against Jason, Hopper against the Demogorgon, and 11 versus Vecna. It's all very satisfying and just overall cool to watch unfold. Classic good versus evil stuff. I thoroughly enjoy these types of stories, and most importantly, all of this stuff feels earned. Whether it's the better writing, how long these episodes are, so it's just more time to build that story, I don't know what it is, but all of this is great to me. I see a lot of comparisons to like a Marvel movie, and yeah, those are definitely fair comparisons. Maybe not what other people have signed up for when it comes to Stranger Things, but all of this, for me, worked. I'm also particularly a big fan of endings like this. All hope seems lost, but then the heroes bounce back and take the upper hand. When it seems like the heroes have everything wrapped up and are about ready to save the day, nope, the villain wins and sets the heroes back by a whole lot. Speaking of Marvel, I truly think Infinity War repopularized this trope, and I love it. I don't think everybody loves it. I'm very surprised by how low the rating is for this episode, and yeah, a 9.1 is pretty low for an episode like this, but I do just kind of think that Max should have died right here. This would have given everyone in the group all the more motivation to find and kill Vecna. Eddie's death is sad for the group in Hawkins, but people like Hopper, Will, Jonathan, Joyce, and 11 don't even know or care for him. 11 using her powers to bring Max back to life, I don't know, kind of cheapens the whole impact of this loss to Vecna. Everyone eventually does reunite in some very heartwarming moments, but the happiness is short-lived because it starts snowing upside-down particles, and the hunt for Vecna is officially on in about another 4 years. If the whole California plotline was even half as good as the other ones, I think this season is easily the best. But It's not, and it really drags this season down. Pair that with some questionable plot holes like how Hopper even got to Russia and the whole group going into the Upside Down through a lake, when apparently there's another portal just in the middle of the road somewhere. There's a fair bit of things that don't make sense, even with this season trying its hardest to connect everything together. Some people might not like the idea of Vecna being the mastermind behind everything because it obviously wasn't set up, and to some degree it does bother me. But they also did a pretty masterful job at trying to make it all fit, and I have to give them credit for that. This season returned to the mysterious, horror-filled vibe that I enjoyed out of season 1, and I think it's far and away the second best season of the show, so I'm giving season 4 an 8.8 out of 10. Stranger Things, as a series, completely baffles me. Season 1 was a show made for adults, but just centered on a younger cast. It was a horror show with a thoroughly gripping mystery, and the show did very well enough to warrant a second season. So the Duffer Brothers continued with their story, which was a love letter to all things 80s, and because they had a higher budget, they were able to achieve things that they couldn't in season 1. Better CGI, more money for licensing songs and films and just overall stuff from the 80s, but this was also when the show got supremely popular, and I think both Netflix and the Duffer Brothers realized their audience was from a variety of ages, not just adults 18 and up. So season 3 lowered that tone, so that way all audiences could enjoy it. If this season had been animated, I think it would have made more sense and not been as jarring of a season, because this season still had darker moments, but also scenes that broke the suspense and seriousness of the situations at hand. Season 4 kinda continued this way, despite going back to the more serious and mysterious roots. This was more of a blockbuster now than the blockbusters season 3 was trying so hard to copy. If this had been in theaters, I imagine we would have gotten some Marvel-esque reactions to it. But part of me still thinks of Stranger Things as this small-town mystery show that was a hidden gem on Netflix for a little while. That if this could have only been a 2 or 3 season show, this would have gone down as one of the all-time greats when it comes to TV. But because of how popular the show got, and because it had to cater to all kinds of different audiences with a wide range of ages, I think this show became a shell of what it could have been, really what it should have been. But Netflix needs their money. This show became a main selling point for Netflix, so what the vast majority of audiences want, they get, even if it turns a niche small-town mystery show into something reminiscent of the Marvel Universe. Those are all my thoughts on Stranger Things seasons 1 to 4. If you're watching this in the future, after season 5 is all out, then you can probably click on screen to watch my breakdown and review of season 5. But if you're watching this in the present, then let me know you want to see that breakdown of season 5 by hitting the like button. I was also going to include a section on my final theories for season 5, so I might make a separate video for that. Let me know if that's something you want to see in the comments down below. Thank you a lot to all my channel members. You guys are the best, and I'll see you all in the next one.